Why a goblin? 201. Chink in the Armor, Book 4. After Roger completed his attack, it was as if it was the signal for all hell to break loose. Roger managed to temporarily halt the attack on one flank, but someone else would have to be responsible for what happened on the other. But at the same time, the main force of the GES participants had reached the main body of the goblins. A group of goblins who looked a little different than the first time the little killer showed orchestrated a battle here. They had newer and shinier weaponry and armor. And it was all thanks to that same force that once came knocking with the little killer. Although some of the gear that they brought and wore with them was utterly destroyed, there were still plenty that had small to large pieces of it that were good enough to be reused, and others were left mostly whole. Now, while goblins considered the people who had that gear as enemies, that didn't mean they couldn't make use of the things they brought with them, especially not when it was all so valuable. So the armor and weapons and whatever else the goblins, Tink goblins in particular, could get their hands on were melted, refitted, and entirely reused for the thousands of goblins gathered here today. Yet, if it was so easy to fill the gap that existed between them and those that sought to do them harm, then wars might as well not ever be fought. Not in this world, at least. Not when the people here could wield enough power to reshape countries. Of course, the chiefs knew this better than anyone, and they did their best to mitigate the amount of pressure their people would be facing. This was proven in full by how Roger was fighting. Everything about it was against the things he believed in when it came to battle, but there was no other choice here. In fact, after claiming the lives of as many riders as he could, he once again had to bring his full attention on the now angered Grafai. Grafai was many things, and despite all of his seemingly negative qualities in the eyes of his uncle, there was one thing he definitely wasn't. A man without feelings. Reserved and shy maybe, but he was not a man without emotion. So seeing his countrymen and their precious mounts fall to the sword of the goblin before him unlocked a different sort of rage that was usually unseen from him, even in the midst of battle. "Goblin, your battle is with me, and I will have your head." Grafai's mount, seemingly in perfect tune with its rider, began gathering vast amounts of earth mana around its feet, and with nothing short of exemplary control and instinctual finesse, began modifying the ground as it ran to ensure a smooth yet blistering speed of running, unlike what it showcased before. It was this ability to modify the earth it ran above that truly gave life to their ability to run on any terrain, especially since it was modifying it in real time before placing a foot down without a single bit of hesitation or mistake. Grafai gathered mana of his own, and this time, before completely reaching Roger, he began his attack in full. Balerian Render. The High Hark of North Balerion brought his weapon down before him in a downward arc that contained the full might of a being at the 7th tier. The earth below him split apart so evenly that it was as if the two sides were running away from each other in a hurry, but that wasn't all. The attack sent forward by the High Hark wasn't a glorified pitfall trap that would open up a hole in the earth for someone to fall in. No, that was just a byproduct of what he really did. That downward arcing slash was real, formed out of mana and the strength of the High Hark. A nearly invisible slash as thick and tall as a tree was ripping up the ground in front of it as it raced towards the waiting Roger. Space itself was bending, but cut away by the slash that tore toward Roger. Of course, Chief Roger was a being that shared the same tier as his attacker, so he could more than see the attack heading his way. And perhaps if this was a true one-on-one battle with no one else involved, then Roger would have simply dodged the attack and followed up with one of his own. Unfortunately for Roger, dodging was not currently an option. There were goblins to his back. This wasn't something he could allow them to face. The mighty chief of the 14 goblin clans grit his teeth, planted his feet, and summoned all the strength and mana held within his body. He would not fall here. He would do his job. He would protect the goblins. He would do as a chief, as a loyal servant of the king must. Ah! He roared out a bellow that shook practically everything but the attack that was heading his way, and lifted his sword over his shoulder before swinging it down with a skill of his own, one he gained upon reaching his newest tier. Groll Vash! Groll Vash. A word that loosely translated to mean loyal wrath. It was nothing short of a skill that truly looked to embody the wrath of a knight who will always point that wrath in the direction of the enemy, causing harm to their king. A skill that was truly fitting for a goblin such as Roger. Once the skill was activated in full with the swinging of Roger's sword, a massive tornado of flames, normally red, orange, and yellow, was colored with a prominent amount of ethereal green, the same green that Rick shared in his own flames. Then the two attacks met. Boom! An inferno of mana was immediately born of the clash, but there was no time for anyone to stop and smell the roses of the result of such a meeting of force and ability. Especially not Chief Roger. Graphi was already upon him, and the look in his eye said one thing. He smelled blood in the water. Despite the rage that colored his face and the amount of power he packed into that attack, he knew it wouldn't kill the goblin before him. It wasn't strong enough to insta-kill even the weakest of Tier 7s as long as they were prepared and saw it coming. But what it did do was cause Chief Roger to overextend himself. He had to protect the goblins behind him after all, which of course created a chink in his armor. One the High Hark would not miss. 202. Difference in Experience, Book 4. The smoke from the battle cleared, and if one wanted to decide a winner from the clash, it would more than likely fall to Roger. He not only blocked the strike, but the power in which Showcase also overpowered it and sent a bit of the flame back towards the direction of the attack. But these aren't the wins that decide a battle, not a battle of this magnitude. The first thing Roger saw once his vision cleared was the powerful mount of the man that attacked once again, riding with power and vigor in his direction. The only thing was that the mount no longer had a rider. The people of North Balarian prided themselves on being the great riders that they were, but if they couldn't also fight on their own 2 feet, then they wouldn't have survived as a nation for as long as they had. Roger didn't care about any of that though. All he knew was that the rider was missing and could be attacking him from any direction. But Roger wasn't a simple goblin, nor was he one that hadn't fought in his own fair share of battles. Roger knew he didn't have time to take his eyes of the beast heading his way and search for the human that should have been riding it. Nor did he even bother trying to use his senses that were already in full alert to try and scan for said human. None of that would serve him in this position. His enemy was too powerful and likely expecting him to choose one of those 2 options. So in that split-second moment, he almost entirely instinctively chose what he felt was his only option: jumping. Roger immediately jumped as high as he could, and in the same motion, he brought his sword down in front of him to catch the beast on the way up. But not only that, powerful flames sprouted from the tip of the sword in a flamethrower-like action and covered the area around him. Just as the flames were about to hit the ground, Graphi's spear came stabbing in from the rear with power. If Roger was still standing there, his back would have been pierced clean through. Even if he guessed right that Graphi was coming from the back, instead of his left or right, for example, turning around to block him would have only left him open to an attack from the rear by the Harkinian, and even he could feel the power that the beast exuded. Of course, jumping in the air didn't mean he was out the fire just yet, and although his flames were not necessarily things Graphi and his mount wanted to deal with, they weren't going to be the end of them, so they stood their ground and rendered attacks upwards to the now falling Roger. Roger would not deserve his title as chief if, and the honor of being the father to a goblin as good as a fighter as Rogue, if he wasn't prepared for at least this much. With a level of deftness that didn't make sense, coming from the bodybuilder of a goblin in Roger, he used the force of the attacks coming at him to forcefully somersault away from the 2 attackers. The second he landed, there was not an ounce of hesitation in his actions as he quickly turned to run towards the few Balarian riders that passed while he dealt with Graphi. Some of them had already reached and were engaged with the goblins, but any who lagged behind quickly had to dodge or otherwise be consumed by the wall of flames that now chased them down. Roger didn't have time to observe the results of said battle as an even more enraged Graphi was once again upon him. Graphi and his mount then began a relentless assault on Roger as 2 separate entities for a few minutes before using a period of pushing back the chief to allow Graphi to mount again. He could fight on his own 2 feet without issue, but his prowess would always be greater when he could fight atop his trusted partner. Something Roger would come to realize in the following exchanges. Yet despite being at a clear disadvantage, There was no worry in the eyes of the chief, no hitches or signs of weakness or cowardice in his movements. He stayed on the back foot for the entirety of the battle, and he was no longer able to stop the advance of the other riders, but his sword did not stop swinging. Grafai's lance did not stop its pursuit of Roga's life, and eventually wounds began piling up on the chief. Though none of it was fatal, and anything that was bleeding too much was immediately cauterized by Roga's flames. Perhaps if he was fighting a battle to the death where he was trying to kill Grafai and his mount, just as much as the former was trying to kill him, then he likely would have lost this battle already, or at least be forced to enact some suicidal actions for the sake of winning. In this scenario, his entire focus was on fighting nothing but a defensive battle, and although Grafai was talented, immensely powerful, fought with a powerful partner, and had gear to match his outputted prowess, there was something he lacked: true desperation. He has fought with his life on the line, he has fought with the lives of his subordinates on the line, he was fought in defense of country even. But even in the last scenario, during his life thus far, he has not experienced any sort of threat so massive that North Balarian itself was at risk. He never had to fight with the pressure that if he were to lose, then his queen and the nation would be no more. He never had to sit on the front lines of a battle where he faced a never-ending horde of monsters for most of their life. But that's what the goblins have been doing. The second they reached a point of being able to fight, they've been forced to go defend their lands on the fronts of the dark lands of Mir. Almost every single day since being born, fighting on the fronts is all they've known. And when that sort of mental fortitude and fighting experience is packed into a being on the level of power and fighting talent like Roga, you get a goblin that is really hard to kill. But Roga and his clan directly bordered the fronts, a role they shared with the Shadow Clan, not something that all the clans could claim to do. And for that reason alone, it is also why not all 14 chiefs claim to be as good a fighter as Chief Roga. 203. Death and Tuval, Book 4. While Chief Roga was fighting for his life and the lives of his fellow goblins, there were other battles taking place. There was no more waiting or build-up to be had here, just war in its purest form. One side versus another, the strongest of one side versus the strongest of the other, the goals of one side versus the goals of another. But thing is, war didn't care about the wishes or aspirations of any one participant. It wouldn't show favor just because you wished for something more than your enemy did. War was war, and if there is one thing that would always be present in a real war, it would be death. While war was started and fought by members of the living, it was both won and lost by members of the dead. If one side has more dead than the other side, then the chance that they won were higher, or if one side has much stronger dead than the other, then the chance that they won were higher. Of course, there are a lot more things involved in a war than just life or death, but that is really what it boils down to. Did you kill more of them than they killed you? Did you kill much stronger beings than they killed of you? Whose death had more of an impact? Were your people just massacred, or were they taking multiple lives on their own before they went down? These are the types of results that shape war. These are the types of happenings that decide which side gets to live to see another day, to fight another day, to live another day in this war between the members of the GES right humans, demi-humans, versus the goblin of the dark lands of Mir. This war is no different. It was started by the living, and it will be finished by the dead, a list of dead that has already started piling up. Humans have died. Demi-humans have died. Goblins have died. But so far, most of the deaths haven't been very impactful. They haven't shifted the tide of the war to the left or to the right, to the goblins or to the members of the GES. It would take either a freakishly large sum of one party dying or the death of a few significant figures, and or both, before these deaths can truly have an impact that shakes the war. This is something that the Spear of Tuval shall see to become a reality. This was arguably the strongest person currently on the battlefield. Yes, Roger and all the other chiefs with him were strong. Yes, all the other Tier 7s on the side of the GES were strong, but this warrior was truly the epitome of war and combat in Tuval. She was at the very peak of the 7th tier, and that was only part of it. Not to mention her individual talent, which is nothing to sleep at, and the amount of experience she has earned over the years. She's not from this current generation, she's not even from the previous generation. This is a woman who has seen civil wars within her own country. Wars that pitted another country against hers, wars crossing borders from humans to demi-humans, wars that embroiled the entire continent. She has lived, seen and fought in more battles than some of her compatriots have been alive. That is how experienced the Spear of Tuval was. That is the type of presence that was now bearing down on the goblins, and to make matters worse, there wasn't even a hitch of regression in anything that she did. She was strong as she's ever been. Her age was not a limiter now, and if anything, it was a multiplier for the Spear of Tuval. Once the melee began in full and the battles kicked off in a chaotic, bloody and gruesome manner, it was time for the Spear of Tuval to leave her mark. She was not one for hesitation or sitting back and allowing others to fight on her behalf. No, she has always led from the front and will always continue to lead from the front. Yes, the knights ran ahead of her to begin the battle, but it was only surface level. She was still leading from the front. Initially, she followed after them while giving out commands, so the start of the battle wouldn't be underestimated by her troops, nor would things be overlooked, like if she were to be the one to kick off the battle. She watched the beginning, she watched the early clashes, she watched the positions of her enemies, she watched the positions of her troops, she watched the commands that her sub-leaders gave out all throughout the battle. She watched everything, took it in, and gave orders from the beginning of the battle before she ran into anyone, until now. Now the foundation of war was set. Now her troops had plenty to go off of. Now she could release the reins on her own battle and spring forth. While there were some people who found enjoyment in battle, who smiled or grinned at the thought of an exciting fight, the Spear of Tuval was not one of them. She was a woman who fought out of nothing but pure duty and loyalty from the day she took up her spear in the service of her kingdom. From the day she was given the mantle of knight to the day she was given command over thousands of troops till now, she has fought out of nothing but duty and loyalty. The type of fighting that was nothing but efficient to the point and didn't leave room for wasted movements, conversations, or anything else of the sort. Once it was time for her to step into the battle, she barreled forth, practically leaping over the knights in front of her and landing amongst the goblins on the other side. Of course, a presence like hers would never be missed by the goblins, and it was very obvious the level of power she sat at was the strongest among them. With Rogur being kept in another part of the battlefield, someone else had to be the one to step up to face the Spear of Tuval, and there wasn't any time to play rock, paper, scissors, or to ask each other who is going to be the one to take that step. No, things had to happen quickly. The Spear of Tuval couldn't be allowed to run rampant within their ranks, or they would lose this battle before it truly began. 204. The Conviction of a Chief, Book 4. Chief Galgo, the chief of the central clan, which was the largest clan in the dark lands of Mir, gripped his sword tightly as charged after the Spear of Tuval with conviction in his eyes and intensity in his steps. He could feel the power wafting off of the woman before him. He could feel clearly that there was a difference, and out here he would be outclassed in terms of pure power, but none of that took anything away from the task at hand. The chief knew deep down in his heart, even Chief Roger would not be able to stand toe-to-toe with this woman. All of them only became Tier 7 fairly recently, and even if their king was able to forcefully evolve them to the 8th tier, it would be some time before something like that could happen. They were far away from the peak of the 7th tier, so there wasn't necessarily a better option, nor would Chief Gago be on the lookout for such an option. He was alive with his weapon in his hand, his king's orders in his mind and in his heart. Stepping up to fight this fearsome woman was his duty, and he will see it done. But as always, when it came to reality, things didn't always go quite as planned. Chief Galgo stepped up with his sword at the ready and immediately began a battle to the death with the Spear of Tuval. Though even if it was that type of battle, he didn't immediately begin carelessly using skills and slinging mana around without care for his surroundings. But the Spear of Tuval did do any of that either, though it was for far different reasons from those of Chief Galgo. The reason the chief didn't use any skills was because they were currently behind the front and in the midst of an array of other goblins. Using any type of powerful skills and abilities here, if he could help it, would only cause more harm than good when it came to protecting his fellow goblins. That was his reason. For the Spear of Tuval, her reasoning was a bit more pragmatic. She felt there was simply no need to use any of her more powerful skills to defeat the enemy before her. This wasn't arrogance, this wasn't ignorance, this wasn't cockiness. This was simple, and unfortunately for the chief and the goblins, the truth. Chief Galgo was not her equal. His sword whizzed and flashed, and her spear reacted in kind, moving as though it was a limb and not a ramrod straight tool taller than even Chief Galgo. It bent, it flexed, it advanced, it retreated, it ambushed, it curved, it was stealthy. It was everything that you would expect from a master of the spear. From being the aggressor to being on the defensive, Chief Galgo was immediately put under pressure. But he did not worry. He did not show cowardice. He just continued to fight, continued to battle, swinging his sword this way and that, but not finding any room for advancement. While, on the other hand, the spear of Tuval was expressionless as she continued to swing her spear. The woman was relentless and powerful. She was everything that she thought she was. Wounds quickly began to pile up on Chief Galgo, and unlike the battle with Chief Roger and Grafai, these ones were more than just surface wounds. They were real and truly dangerous to anyone who was receiving them. His shoulder was pierced, his thigh was gashed, his abdomen was pierced straight through from the front to the back. The wounds continued to pile up at an alarming rate, but there was no help coming. There was no room for further errors and wounds, yet they continued to pile up. He was bleeding profusely, but all he did was continue to grit his teeth and continue to fight, because he had no other choice. This was a battle he had to fight. This was something he had to do. This was his life. This was his duty. He was a chief. He served the king. And he would want nothing else but to fight and die in service of said king, in service of his clan, and in service of his people. Though unfortunately for the central clan's chief, that reality was getting closer and closer with each exchange with the spear of Tuval. But Chief Galgo would not die on someone else's terms. He would serve his king, yes. He would serve his kind, yes. He would serve his people, yes. But his death, unless explicitly ordered by his king, would be on his own terms. Chief Cargo yelled out, "Brakun! Brakun! Brakun!" He yelled out, he screamed out, he bellowed out, "Brakun! Brakun!" It was the old tongue of the goblins. Of course, this was for no one else but his goblins, and while those at Tier 7 and above could understand different meanings from different languages, even if they didn't understand them explicitly, there were some languages that were either impossible to decipher or took a bit longer to understand. The old tongue of the goblins was one such language. The other goblins understood, but it took a second for the spear of Tuval to understand. The goblins began to retreat rapidly, and by the time the spear of Tuval understood what was happening, it was too late. Like Rogue once did to protect and secure the escape of his king, Chief Galgo was now doing the same. But the difference was remarkable. Rogue was a general, yes, but a Tier 5 general. Chief Galgo was a chief of the 7th tier. That level of gap in power was not one to be taken lightly. He ignited the mana in his heart and roared out. A ferocious war that seemed to shake even someone as powerful as the spear of Tuval. She could feel the intensity in his roar, the conviction in his shout. For the king, the central clan, and all of goblin kind, forgive me, my king, this one shall go on first. And just like that, Chief Galgo self-destructed. 205. Destructive Results, Book 4. If Rogue alone self-destructing was enough of a problem to at least annoy a being 2 full tiers above him, then someone on the level of Chief Galgo doing the same thing was nothing short of cataclysmic. The area around him didn't take very long to become void of life for anyone below Tier 7, or perhaps even some weaker members of the 7th tier. Whoever was caught in that blast would see nothing but death or get very close to it, and without a doubt anyone who was below that realm was no more. Thankfully, due to the conviction and intensity in which Chief Galgo roared out his warnings to his fellow goblins, all of them who weren't perhaps already dying in a battle against the enemy, retreated as far as they could, and while the spear of Tuval responded late, she still did respond, and those of her compatriots who managed to hear her in time did their best to retreat as well, but late was late. The chief's self-destruction, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side of the battle you stood on, worked like a charm. Hundreds of people perished in that explosion, along with hundreds more that were at least hurt to varying degrees. The vast majority of the GES fighting force was in that central space fighting against the goblins, and the results spoke for themselves. The area was not only void of life, but it also seemed to be void of even mana, practically feeling like space itself was cut apart. Though that last part simply couldn't be true, because the chief did not have control over laws, but that was the feeling it gave off to those who witnessed the devastation that just took place. Then there was the actual appearance of the area. Trees were no more, the grass was no more, and even the perennial darkness itself seemed to get pushed away, though it was still dark in such a way that it was beyond the regular levels of eeriness. It was unsettling to say the least, but it was nothing short of utter and brutal devastation that remained of the area and space left by the explosion. What was even more unsettling was just how fast it happened and how quickly the surrounding landscape was vastly made anew. 1 second, the forest was as it's been for many years, even with the war going on, but it was now permanently changed just due to the power of one goblin. In the place where Chief Galgo once stood was now a massive hole that was wide and deep enough to be a small lake. Now perhaps, if the area wasn't as mana-rich as it was due to the presence of Mir, then the hole could have been far larger. Either way, the self-destruction of the Chief Galgo wasn't a waste. Once the Spear of Tuval fully took in the state of the battlefield and state of the troops she commanded, she gritted her teeth and immediately ordered a full retreat. Orders very quickly passed down to grab the bodies that could be gathered, since a good amount of them were either reduced to nothing, or there were now just bits and pieces of flesh. Those would unfortunately have to be left alone. Of course, she made sure to pass the order that anyone who could still be saved, even if the chance was small, was to be rescued as quickly as possible to be given medical attention. She was not in the business of leaving troops behind, so one by one, night by night, demi-human by demi-human, the GES pulled out of the woods and began a retreat back to their base just outside. The goblins did not bother attacking them for fear of risking another full-scale battle right then and there during the retreat, for they needed the same respite, especially when it came to goblins like Chief Roger, who had been fighting the High Hark of North Beleriand this entire time. Grafai would have wanted nothing more than to continue the battle, but orders were orders, and he too could see the devastation of the self-destruction of the enemy. He quickly whistled out to his riders that still remained and ensured that anyone who was still alive, returned anybody that he could grab would be grabbed, and that wasn't just his riders, but their mounts as well. He too did not believe in leaving his troops or their dead bodies behind. They would be preserved and returned to their families, and the bodies of their mounts would be buried properly with the respect and honor granted to them in North Beleriand. So eventually what was a chaotic, brutal, and downright bloody battlefield, filled with the sounds of abilities, the sounds of warring, living, and dying feet on the ground, roaring sounds of mounts wailing with their riders, the noise of people giving their final death cries, and everything else one could expect from the sounds of a war. Simply put, war was not a quiet thing. The forest floor was soaked with blood from so many different species that in some areas of higher concentration, it began to take on a different color, but one that would be hard to determine due to the weird way it mixed with the darkness of Mir. Anyway, the goblins ordered a full retreat themselves and returned back to their clan grounds. Wounds be nursed, bodies would be laid to rest, and a small moment to clear the mental exhaustion that came from fighting a battle of that magnitude, from witnessing so many of their people die, from seeing a well-respected chief pay the ultimate price. Unfortunately for them, though, with the type of battle they were fighting, there would be no time to mourn the loss of Chief Galgo or any other goblin that lost their lives today. Even though every single one of them felt it, the fact that there were no longer 14 chiefs to match the 14 clans who resided in Mir. All of the remaining 13 knew that that number might not necessarily be the case by the time their Jing came back, but such was the price to pay, and it was a price every single one of them was willing to pay. And there was just no telling how many more of them would have to pay it. 206. Reorganizing and Planning, Book 4. Prufan of North Beleriand was one of the few Tier 6s still remaining in the camp, once everyone else stormed off to battle. The others who remained with him were there to manage the things that were left behind. Things such as mounts for North Beleriand and any other group that arrived at the camp through riding. Of course, there weren't just mounts for battle or even travel in the camp either. They were joined by plenty of beasts of labor whose jobs it had been to get the necessary supplies here. Basically, there were still a lot of remaining people in the camp. Though if they were to be observed from a distance, it would be easy to forget that this was a camp of people who just went off to war. Of course, it wasn't like the people here were already celebrating the victory against the goblins, but there didn't seem to be any doubt or worry in their faces or actions as they waited for the return of the forces that set off in pursuit of the goblins. Yes, there's a good chance that the group suffered some casualties, but they didn't believe the casualties would be so much that their victory would be an empty one. The victory they expected should be a concise, deliberate, and without a shadow of a doubt, an overwhelming victory. And when this victory was achieved, the group would march back into the camp with the head of the so-called King of Goblins. That was what everyone in the camp believed, the type of beliefs that weren't necessarily discussed in the open, but just something that was kind of understood. But those same understandings and beliefs didn't take very long to melt away when the sight of the members they so happily watch march away to fight against the goblins. Return grim expressions, dead bodies of their comrades, and a long line of wounded that didn't paint picture of the type of victory that was expected. Needless to say, those remaining in the camp were shocked. But although they were shocked, nobody in the camp was unaware about the reality of war. Things that went against the perceived natural order of things will happen regardless of how they felt or believed in the midst of war. So while they were initially caught off guard, no in camp was standing still or moving leisurely any longer. Everyone sprang into action quickly. Medical supplies were rounded up as makeshift hospitals were quickly set up, and plenty of actions were taken to ensure that the bodies that were brought back up would be preserved properly. Things like documenting who died, figuring out who hadn't returned as a body or with their order or group. All of this was to ensure that the right families would be properly notified about the loss of their loved one, even if their bodies weren't properly recovered. Of course, this was just part of everything that was going on, and priority had been given to trying to save the lives of those who were least likely to make it and on from there. Now, although everything continued to happen quickly, as even though they didn't necessarily foresee something like this happening, they were prepared for it nonetheless. But that didn't mean they could speed up time. Everything that was happening now would not require solutions beyond a single night. The entire group needed to be reorganized, and there would be plenty of recovery and rest that would need to happen, which meant the leaders of the GES force would need to conduct a full assessment of the extent of the situation and just how much of a hit they took. Something the Spear of Tuval took full charge of, and after a string of orders were passed around. Not even caring about the different chains of command that all the groups had, she promptly called for a meeting of all the leaders. Because while the goblins lost one of their Tier 7s, not a single one was lost on the side of the GES forces. It didn't take long for all of them to gather in the same command tent that the initial plan was made in. Even Graphai showed up without needing any sort of prodding from his uncle. He would still not necessarily be much of a talker in the meeting, but the seemingly permanent scowl that rooted itself on his face told his uncle more than words could ever describe. Not when he knew the type of man his nephew was. The meeting began with everyone having a bunch of different opinions. Some were upset, some were embarrassed, some were ready to shift blame to others. But before the meeting could get out of control, people like Prufan and the Spear of Tuval eventually got everyone under control and pointed towards a solution. One they eventually reached a consensus on. We made a mistake. While we expected them to fight a fierce battle, a being that sat on the 7th tier of power was not someone we saw being willing to self-destruct, especially not this soon in the battle. That is the type of resolve and loyalty that is rarely seen among beings that have reached a certain level of power. But we know this now. Getting caught off guard once is excusable, twice is unforgivable. So it is in our best interest to assume that the rest of them have the same level of conviction and resolve packed into their green bodies. We need to treat them, especially those of the 7th tier, like ticking time bombs waiting to go off at the faintest sign of their impending doom. That is our mistake, and it will not happen again. Which brings me to the second thing we learned. They valued their fellow goblins. It is highly unlikely that the Tier 7 goblins would be willing to self-destruct without issuing something of a warning to the weaker goblins around them. We will use that to our advantage. In the next battle, we will surround them and squeeze them in as best as possible. No fights away from the group. They already want to be on the defensive, so we will let them. Force them to fight in close quarters where they will be hesitant to do self-destruct once more. This does not eliminate the possibility of them doing it, but now that we know to watch for it, we can properly react to it. Put our hands around their throats and tighten the grip ever so slowly to not spook them, but enough to whittle down their numbers. Are there any questions? Not hearing any, Prufan continued on. Good, then we will move on to the next topic. Finding their king. 207, What We're Up Against, Book 4. Yes, the coward was refused to come out to fight. I heard he was strong and didn't hesitate to raise up arms against my fellow knights led by the minister, but to think he would prefer to hide now in a real war, letting his people sacrifice themselves just so he can live. That is no king to me, just a coward. It was the words of one of the knight commanders of Verdun that resounded in the room, letting everyone know just how he felt about the so-called king of goblins. I understand how you feel, but I do think you're judging these goblins with human values, and it would be wise to remember that these are not in fact like us. For us, a king or a queen is usually the person who is the strongest, or commands the strongest family in the kingdom, or perhaps their family has ruled said kingdom for generations already, and they still maintain that strength. It is not necessarily their right or God-given bloodline that has given them power. Now this may sound a bit like treason in the eyes of my own queen, so I hope she can forgive me. Either way, from what history has told us regarding the king of goblins, then we know that position isn't one that's argued over. There isn't a debate, nor is there a war to be had. The king of goblins is the king of goblins. They are the sole ruler of their people, and every single goblin will follow them with utmost loyalty and dedication. That is what we're going up against. Now all of us have received the reports of the very same battle you spoke of, Knight Commander, and through those reports we learned that your minister nearly killed the very same goblin we are here to kill. So with that being said, I highly doubt the goblins would want him running around the battlefield while we unleash all manner of skills to reap his life. Which leaves me to believe the goblins have chosen to hide their king in an effort to protect him from us and taken on the brunt of the pain instead. They cannot and do not want to lose him. It is important to remember that. Of course, none of that changes our goal here. We came here to kill the king of goblins, and that is what we will do. And it is time to reintroduce the shadows of Verdun and the Black Wolf tribe back to the battle. We kept them at bay because an all-out frontal assault isn't really their forte, but their skills are needed once more. We will use the battle that we will fight in the coming days as distraction for them to go behind enemy lines to find and potentially eliminate their king. I expect them to face heavy resistance, but it is vital that they find the location of the king. We will move forward with the plan to slowly strangle them out, while those that work in the shadows conduct their business. As meeting of the GES forces went on, the goblins did the same, and they were generally about the same thing, just a bit different. They talked about reorganizing and getting medical attention to those that needed it. Where they differentiated a bit was that the goblins weren't necessarily concerned with going to find the leaders of their enemies, nor were they interested in going on the front foot and attacking them as a whole. No, they simply wanted to ensure that they continued to defend and come up with more ways to survive until their king returned. In fact, there were even a few discussions about potentially sending a small contingent out to find and bring their king back. But the argument didn't reach far, because of not only the trust they still had in him, but also the fact that they couldn't afford to be without anyone of significant strength, especially not with the loss of Chief Galgo. Instead of sending anyone out, they instead were forced to weaken the fronts even more than they already were. They had lost a lot of troops in that initial battle, and fighting against the humans with anything less would be setting themselves up for failure. Both the goblins and the GES force did what they had to do, and very quickly 5 days passed without anything at all happening. But eventually the war had to begin anew. This time, while the goblins had individuals watching the forests, they didn't see the same provocative march from the GES force. This time, they saw them very late as they weren't trying to be seen any longer and did their best to hide using a cloak of mana to hide their advance for as long as possible, until the goblins finally saw them and had no choice but to rush out and meet the advance of the force before they got any closer. What was similar from the previous battle, though, was the opening salvo of mana being flung from both sides. But of course both sides were similarly prepared to have to deal with it, and all it really did was delay the start of melee portion of the battle. The Knight Orders pushed forward slowly and methodically, pushing the goblins back as they did so, before the goblins rooted themselves in and decided they weren't going to go back much further than their current point if they could help it. They weren't going to allow themselves to be pushed back all the way to where their clans were. At some point they would stop and hold their ground, and that is what they did with the Tier 7 chiefs at the forefront of the group, taking on the brunt of the attacks. A battle where they were now pinned next to their fellow goblins and therefore restricted in the abilities they could use ensued from that point. Of course, the restricts only applied to abilities that would cause damage to everything that was around them. Goblins like Chief Roger was still launching fire from blade to anyone who dared to stand before him, while Chief Jlug was still able to continuously try to drown the members of the GES force. This began a grueling back and forth as one side tried to defend while the other did their best to kill. It was the moment when the goblins were staring down the slope of a long and drawn-out death that they would come to remember as beginning of their retribution, while the humans and demi-humans would remember it is the last time they had a real chance of stopping the goblins before the rise. 208. Needles, Book 4. The Shadows of Verdun and the members of the Black Wolf tribe has both learned firsthand that the goblins were not to be trifled with when it came to their capabilities in the dark. That they too possessed their own special forces, even and similarly special skills. But a good amount of those very same goblins were now a part of the main fighting force facing the frontal assault of the GES force. As a result, the Shadows and the Black Wolves had a bit more wiggle room in their actions. Only there was one major reason why the Goblin chiefs weren't able to double up against another of the Tier 7s in the first battle. It was because the chief of the Shadow clan had a very special role to play in all of this. The goblins weren't stupid. Some of the things they did and the tactics they thought of might have been a little straightforward, but they weren't stupid. All of them knew what the situation was and who their enemies were here for. And since that person wasn't seen on the battlefield, it is only to be expected that their enemies will try to look for him. There needed to be some type of defense in place to stop them from finding out anything about the location of their king. Especially since for them to actually reach him, they would need to run through homes of all the goblins in the dark lands of Mir. It was up to the chief of the Shadow clan and his fellow clan members to stop this from happening and defend their people from all attacks in the dark. Of course, this didn't actually end up happening in that initial battle, but instead of lowering their guard, all that did was have them raise it. During the 5-day break, they even made sure to double and triple check if anyone had managed to intrude upon their territory under their noses. So their guards were raised to utmost. Though there was one thing that the Shadows of Verdun and the Black Wolf tribe didn't account for. The only way to enter the deeper lands where the members of the clans lived was to go down a steep drop. The drop itself wasn't the problem, it was instead the fact it was the only way in, which meant Chief Gruul knew that too. Needless to say, that entire ridge was now covered in the darkness as the chief let his mana loose. So battles began in the dark just as they were being fought in the light, and from the second everything started once more, the goblins were once again on the back foot overall. 2 weeks. For 2 weeks the goblins had to fight tooth and nail just to defend their lives and their homes. So many of them died that they even had to stop taking people from the fronts, lest they get overrun too. There weren't battles every day since those beneath the 7th tier simply could not force themselves to fight for that long without rest, even if their superiors would be able to push through that level of fatigue. And realistically, the goblins were not going to lose in a single battle, so the GES force would inflict pain and damage before going through an orderly retreat. The goblins couldn't afford to pursue in case they opened themselves up to a counterattack after being caught out, so they would retreat, tend to their wounds as well, before having to rally once more because the GES force wouldn't rest for more than a day or two, not when they were in such fine control of the situation. This happened over and over again over the course of the past 2 weeks, and by now the goblins had no choice but to grow a little desperate. At this rate, it would only be a matter of time before they simply couldn't field enough bodies to maintain this facade of a war and perhaps be forced into self-destruction once more. So out of desperation, the goblins decided it was to take a risk. It was calculated and planned, but it would be a risk nonetheless. It was after the GES force had finished their moment of rest, and they were once again marching towards the goblins. As always, the opening salvo of magic and explosions ensued, but unlike previously, where the goblins would just sit back and wait for them to reach, two of their chiefs used the cover of mana to approach the far left flank of the humans in particular. The far left flank was home to one of the Knight Commanders of Verdun and the Knight Order that followed him. It was their job to ensure no goblins on their side of the battle left the semicircle shape the GES force had around the goblins, and to focus on pinning them in further and further. Chief Cog and Chiefess Hugala were already positioned away from their fellow goblins and waited patiently in the wings for their signal to move, which was all the explosions that were happening. Once it was their time, both of them took off towards the Knight Commander. Chief Cog was in the front, and the Chiefess made sure to use his big frame to keep her body hidden. Eventually, the Knight Commander noticed the approach of the large goblin and moved to intercept before calling over for support. Chief Goblin engaged with brutal force, only to be met with a force of the same level, and stalemate was reached. One that only lasted a few moments because the Knight Commander didn't notice the arrival of the small Tink Goblin until it was too late. The Chiefess pulled out a sword of sorts. It really didn't have a traditional hilt and was far too narrow and skinny to resemble a proper sword. At a glance, it looked far more like a needle than a sword. The Chiefess was a weaver. It is only right that her weapon favored her most used tool. She let go of the needle-like sword, and instead of it hitting the ground, it only dangled from her hand, since it was held by a thread of mana. Not wasting a single second further, due to the fact they had made use of their current advantage, Chiefess Hugala let out a roar and flicked her wrist forward, sending the needle sword spiraling through the air and piercing through the neck of the Knight Commander that didn't room or time to dodge or even block. This was the first kill of an opposing Tier 7 that the goblins earned. 209, Soul Weaver, Book 4. The mighty Tink Goblin was able to work with Chief Cog to kill one of the Knight Commanders and therefore severely weaken the fighting force they would have to face. But the fighting wasn't over yet. Both of them were now essentially behind enemy lines as support quickly came running in their direction. To make matters worse for the two, their fellow goblins would not be able to join them in any sort of rescue mission. So it would be up to the two chiefs to deal with the fallout of their actions. While Chief Cog was getting ready to run, Chiefess Hugala had other thoughts. She looked back towards Chief Cog and shouted out, "Run, I will cover our retreat." "No. Either we run together or we will stay here and die together." But Chiefess Hugala was having none of it. She yelled back at Chief Cog with a voice and tone that left no room for negotiation. "I said to run. Now, my old bones don't got much life left in them anyway." Of course, since having reached the 7th tier, her old bones were stronger and filled with more life than they had ever been. But no one was going to remind her of that. Either way, she wouldn't be denied her moment of glory, and seemingly understanding that Chief Cog gritted his teeth and squeezed his hands so hard they had somehow went from a deep shade of green to nearly white before turning and running away. Seeing back of Chief Cog vanishing into the trees, Chiefess Hugala allowed herself a small smile before turning around to face the collection of power that was approaching her. Another Knight Commander of Verdun, and over 1,000 total knights, were rapidly gaining on her. She knew without a shadow of a doubt they could see the body of their fellow human dead on the forest floor. They would want nothing more than to inflict unimaginable pain upon her. Unfortunately for them, she had already resigned herself to death in this moment, so she did not care what they had prepared. Instead, her entire focus was on the one skill that she possessed. It was a powerful skill, one that she had yet to use in her life, and since her efforts were only reward with such a thing only recently on her ascent to the 7th tier. While she didn't have a status screen like Rick to read a specific description of said skill, the mana would tell her everything she needed to know. And it did. As she was a weaver, the skill was indeed related to weaving, but instead of weaving threads of mana like she did with her needle sword, she would be weaving threads made from her very soul. the most powerful sort of threads she could ever make. So while it was powerful, it wasn't one she necessarily wanted to use just because of the repercussions she would face from using her soul itself as a weapon. With the smile now missing from her face, Chiefess Hugala looked towards her approaching enemies and muttered the name of her skill. Vazraka. Immediately, ethereal with a faint bluish hue, threads began to sprout from the Tink Goblin's body. Each and every one of them pulsed with so much mana that the air around each seemed to shimmer and pulse alongside with them. How could they not? These were threads made from the soul of a Tier 7 being, someone near the peak of this world. She raised her hands up, and with a roar she pushed her hands forward, and the world around her seemed to freeze for just a moment before the threads coiled back and then barreled forwards towards the knights approaching her. The approaching Knight Commander swung his sword at the ethereal threads, and while some of them were destroyed, a few coiled themselves around his sword before it too lit up with mana, and the threads that grabbed it were destroyed. He continued on his path towards Chiefess Hugala, but all she did was continue to move around with speed while sending more and more threads towards the Knight Commander. Now, while the Knight Commander could seemingly destroy the threads, the same couldn't be said for the knights that joined him in the battle. The threads didn't seem to have a limit to their number or distance they could travel, and they stormed through the ranks of knights like a rainstorm coating the world in its splendor. Nothing they did could destroy the threads, and while it didn't pierce, cut, or slice a single one of them, it coiled around them and squeezed. Not quite enough to wring the life out of them like a boa constrictor, what the threads did was far more deadly. The soul contained the life of the shell that dwelled around it. All that you were was contained in your soul. If the life of the soul was no more, then shell it dwelled within would also be no more. So it only made sense that threads that were quite literally formed from the soul of Chiefess Hugala would have their entire focus be on draining the life of whatever it touched. It was the type of power that would have entire countries hailing Chiefess Hugala as an evil being. But Rick and her fellow goblins would never look at her like that. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for the Tink Goblin. The threads were powerful, but every single one of them contained pieces of her soul. She was quite literally using it to make them and give power to each one. And while the knights weren't able to destroy them, every hit and every attack they faced was quite literally her soul taking the hit itself. Then when it came to the Knight Commander, who was actually able to destroy the threads, she was losing her pieces of her soul every single time a thread was destroyed. To make matters worse, she was completely on the back foot, as the Knight Commander wasn't unperturbed in the slightest, as he swung a mana-covered sword around at every thread that came in his direction. Even the ones that managed to make contact with his body wasn't able to stay long enough to inflict any reasonable damage to his soul. The more the battle went on, it looked more and more like Chiefess Hugala's life would be lost right here. But that was when Chief Cog, who she thought had returned to safety, came roaring back and unleashed a full-powered swing towards the Knight Commander, who had sensed him coming and blocked in time, only to find the chief was no longer looking at him and had grabbed a now severely weakened Chiefess Hugala and began sprinting away. The Knight Commander would have loved to chase after them, but not when a majority of his knights were either dead or dying on the ground from having their souls drained of life. 210. What is Wrath? Book 4. What is wrath? The answer to this question could be a very simple one. It is simply extreme levels of anger. But is that all there really is to wrath? Just being extremely angry? No, perhaps it is more than that. Perhaps it is a young boy who lived in a small town where they hunted for game and tended to their farms, and that's how they survived. It was the type of town where everyone knew each other across multiple generations, and the people would never leave. The type of place where every now and then there would be a festival held in celebration of something, like the village chief's birthday or a really good harvest. Maybe they would save up what meager funds they had to buy something cheap, but expensive and worth it to them, from one of those traveling caravans that came once in a blue moon. Maybe that boy would go out to hunt one day, and when he came back, a sibling of his would be missing, lost in the woods. And when searching for said sibling, they found that they had been bitten by a wolf. They survived the bite, but their leg would no longer be usable. Is the emotion that young boy feels toward that wolf wrath? Or is that still just extreme anger? What is wrath? Perhaps it is the story of a young baron who had only recently taken over from their own father as the lord of the barony. But this was a barony that was struggling for money. They weren't poor per se, but they were definitely far less well off than their counterparts. But this baron in particular served under a not-so-kind count, and this was a count who kept raising taxes every single year, without seemingly any good reason. And to meet these taxes that the baron must pay, he had no choice but to raise taxes in his own barony unless he went broke. His coffers were already low and practically non-existent already. Workers had to be laid off, warriors of the family had to find new lords, and meals were no longer quite so succulent. What does he feel toward the count who has put him in this position? To force himself to wring dry his own barony, his own people. To watch peasants he should be responsible for starve to death just so they could meet the taxes out of fear of committing a crime. What does he feel toward the count? Is it wrath? Or is it still just anger? What is wrath? Maybe it's the story of a young woman who was a daughter of a merchant family. In fact, she had never wanted for anything growing up. And to make it even better, she had not grown to be a vile woman. She was kind, fair, and reserved. For all intents and purposes, she was a nice young woman, and as a matter of fact, she was of prime wedding age. So her father and mother did what any good parents would do at this time. They arranged a husband for her, one that also came from a suitable family and had just as suitable of a reputation. Everything was great. They had met on more than one occasion, spoken to each other plenty of times, and although she was still a little shy and perhaps nervous at the thought of being married, she had come to terms with it and was now even looking forward to spending the rest of her life with her soon-to-be husband. Only to be told, just a few days out from the wedding, that it would be off. The marriage contract ripped to shreds and all conversations with the other family cut off. What does this young woman feel toward the man that was supposed to be her husband, but instead chose to rip her heart out of her chest and shred it to pieces? Is it wrath? Or is that still just anger? What is wrath? Or better yet, perhaps it is the life of the ill-forgotten prince, one born of a different mother, a mother that was out of favor with the king of the nation, a mother that was now dead, his only protection, his only source of hope, his only place of existing without judgment. Gone. From above and around him, he scorned by those who should be called his family, forgotten by the man who should be his father, and abhorred by the citizens he should rule. Treated like a stray dog, where life as a prince is nothing more than a shackle meant to ridicule and mock him in place of what he really was in the eyes of his peers. A stain. What does he feel toward these people? Is it wrath or is it anger? What is wrath? Or maybe it is something a member of the town guard can relate to far better. Their jobs were one of simplicity, yet at the same time consistent in its complexity and variety. They were to protect the town from intruders, stop those inside the town from causing violent problems, or capture and bring to justice those who had already crossed the line between innocence and guilt. How would they feel if they weren't able to do their job? Because a group of bandits raided the town, killed members of their family, killed members of the town guard, and escaped with their lives. What would that member of the town guard feel toward these bandits? Surely it is wrath, and not just meager anger. Surely the thing all of these people felt was real wrath toward those who sought to do them harm. Wrath is not just anger. It is anger that walks hand in hand with action, ruthlessness, and the lack of mercy. It is only when all those things come together into one that wrath is formed. Wrath is only an avenue for destruction, the type of destruction that doesn't end until the reason for the wrath has been eradicated to satisfaction. But if such is the wrath of a regular individual, then what is the wrath of a king? Not a king who had to fight their way into power or inherited it just based on the fact that their family ancestor started a kingdom hundreds of years ago. A king through blood, blood born of the world itself. A king by birthright, backed by the laws of existence. What is the wrath of such a king? How does it show itself on the world? And who had the unfortunate fate of experiencing such a wrath? What could they have possibly done to bring such a thing upon themselves? To bring upon the wrath of a king? A goblin king? What is wrath?